Hello everyone and welcome to Spill Secret. Before we start, we ask you subscribe and leave a comment as to where you are listening from. Let's begin. Nights along Route 19 were as empty as the memories Sarah had tried to bury. She stared through the windshield of her beat-up truck, watching the road disappear under the headlights. The old highway stretched on, silent and forsaken, winding through miles of thick pine forest and foggy stretches that seemed to swallow sound itself. Sarah wasn't one to get spooked easily, but tonight felt different, as if something out there was waiting, lurking just beyond her view. The first strange thing she noticed was the absence of other cars. Route 19 wasn't a bustling highway, but on any normal night, she'd see a few headlights in the distance, maybe an occasional truck rumbling by. Tonight, though, she was alone. The radio crackled in the background, unable to latch onto a single clear station. Every now and then, snippets of eerie, distorted voices seeped through the static, like fragments of conversations half heard in a nightmare. "Is anyone out there?" A woman's voice whispered through the static, and Sarah instinctively turned the volume down. She laughed nervously, scolding herself for letting her imagination run wild. Yet, the silence that followed felt thicker, pressing against her chest. She adjusted her rearview mirror and froze. There, in the dim reflection, she caught a glimpse of someone, sitting in the back seat. But when she spun around, the seat was empty. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles pale. "It's just a trick of the light," she muttered, more for her own benefit than anything else. She was tired, worn out from a long shift at the diner, and was sure her mind was just playing tricks on her. After all, she'd driven Route 19 dozens of times without incident. But tonight felt like the road had a mind of its own, twisting in ways that didn't seem right, stretching longer than usual, as if it never wanted her to leave. The further she drove, the more the road seemed to narrow, the trees encroaching on both sides, their branches arching over her like skeletal fingers. Then she saw it, a gas station, old and run down, its neon sign flickering erratically. She didn't remember ever seeing a gas station on this stretch, but the thought of stopping, even for a minute, was a relief. Maybe she could shake off the strange sense of unease that clung to her like a second skin. She pulled up to the pump, her headlights illuminating the cracked, faded asphalt, and the peeling paint of the station's front. The place looked like it had been abandoned for years, yet a dim light glowed in the window. Sarah hesitated, then grabbed her phone and her purse, stepping out of the truck. The silence here was almost oppressive, the kind that made her ears ring, as if sound had simply given up and left this place to its ghosts. "Hello," she called, walking up to the grimy window. Her reflection stared back, shadowed and distorted in the glass. There was a counter inside, empty, save for an old register covered in dust. She was about to turn back when she saw movement from the corner of her eye, a figure, just a blur, darting past the window, and into the shadows beyond. Her heart pounded, but curiosity outweighed her fear. Sarah pushed open the door, the bell overhead jangling, breaking the silence like a gunshot. The air inside was stale, carrying the faint, musty scent of old newspapers and gasoline. She took a cautious step inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The walls were lined with shelves, but they were empty, save for a few cans of beans and dusty candy bars. "Can I help you?" A voice rasped from behind the counter. Sarah spun around, finding an old man standing there, watching her with dark, unreadable eyes. His face was pale, his clothes threadbare, as if he hadn't left this place in years. I didn't expect anyone to be here," Sarah stammered, caught off guard. "I just needed a quick break from the road." It's so quiet out there tonight. The man nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on her face with a strange intensity. Not many people take this road anymore, he said, his voice low and gravelly. Not since the accidents. Sarah's stomach churned, an inexplicable dread settling over her. Accidents. Oh, yes, he replied, his lips curling into a grim smile. They say people see things on Route 19. Things that aren't meant to be seen. As he spoke, the dim light above them flickered, casting shadows that seemed to dance across the room. Sarah swallowed, her hand tightening around her purse strap. I should get going, she muttered, edging toward the door. The old man's gaze never wavered. Be careful out there, miss, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Once you start seeing them, they don't go away. A chill raced down Sarah's spine as she stepped back into the cold night air. She climbed into her truck, locked the doors, and glanced at the gas station one last time. The old man was gone. In his place, a shadow lingered in the window, watching her, unmoving, until her truck pulled back onto the road. The engines hummed did little to calm Sarah's nerves as she drove further down Route 19. She kept glancing in her rearview mirror, half expecting to see that shadowy figure from the gas station watching her from the back seat. The road felt narrower now, as if it was slowly closing in on her, and her headlights seemed to barely pierce the dark. She'd never felt this unsettled, even on the loneliest of roads, and the old man's words echoed in her mind, once you start seeing them, they don't go away. After several tense miles, a sudden burst of light caught her attention. In the distance, a pair of headlights flared to life, beaming straight at her. Sarah's heart raced, and she squinted, trying to make out the vehicle. It was stationary, parked diagonally across both lanes, blocking her path. As she drew closer, she realized it was an old, rusted pickup truck, its paint chipped and peeling, like it had been left to rot on this road for decades. Hello. She called out, rolling down her window slightly as she pulled to a stop a few yards away. There was no answer, only the soft rustle of the trees in the wind. She scanned the area around the truck, but there was no sign of anyone nearby. She thought about reversing, taking another route, but something kept her rooted there, a morbid curiosity or perhaps the faintest sliver of hope that she wasn't alone on this road after all. Just as she reached for her phone, the truck's headlights dimmed, then flickered off, leaving her in near total darkness. Sarah shivered, her hand hovering over the gearshift. She was about to reverse when she heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the back of her truck. The sound was almost playful, like someone drumming their fingers against the metal, daring her to turn around. Her hands shook as she twisted in her seat, peering through the rear window. The darkness outside was so thick it felt almost tangible, pressing against the glass. She couldn't see anything at first, but then she spotted a faint outline, a figure standing just a few feet behind her truck, their features obscured by the shadows. Her heart thundered as the tapping stopped, replaced by a low, whispering voice that seemed to seep into her mind, slithering into her thoughts. "Why are you here, Sarah?" The voice was barely audible, a hoarse whisper that sounded like it was being dragged through layers of gravel. She recoiled, heart pounding. No one knew her name out here. She hadn't told the man at the gas station, and she hadn't passed another soul. Yet, somehow, this presence on the road knew her, knew exactly who she was. Who are you?" she stammered, her voice barely escaping her lips. She fumbled with the ignition, ready to bolt, but as she turned the key, the engine sputtered and died, leaving her stranded in the silent darkness. Panic surged through her, every instinct screaming at her to get out and run. But she knew, deep down, that running wouldn't save her, not here. The figure took a step closer, coming into the faint glow of her truck's interior light. She could make out a face now, pale and expressionless, with eyes that seemed to hollow into nothingness. The figure's mouth opened, but instead of words, a guttural scream erupted, raw and inhuman, echoing through the night. Sarah clamped her hands over her ears, but the sound vibrated inside her skull, filling her mind with an overwhelming sense of dread and despair. Without thinking, she slammed her fist against the dashboard. The lights flickered, and her truck roared to life, jolting forward with a sudden burst of speed. She didn't look back, not even as she heard the figure's scream fade into the distance. She drove fast, faster than she'd ever driven before, her only thought to escape whatever nightmare had taken root on Route 19. Several minutes passed, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still following her, lingering just out of sight. She dared a glance in the rearview mirror, but the road behind her was empty. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. Her phone buzzed in the cup holder, and she jumped, clutching her chest. She glanced at the screen. It was a text message, from an unknown number. The words sent a fresh wave of fear coursing through her. "You can't escape us, Sarah. Not on this road." She threw the phone down, too terrified to respond, and focused on the road ahead. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was this some twisted prank, or was she truly being haunted by something beyond her understanding? As if in answer, the radio crackled to life, and she heard that same gravelly voice from before, whispering her name over and over. The road began to change, becoming unfamiliar even though she'd driven it countless times. She passed landmarks she didn't recognize, an old, crumbling bridge, a cluster of trees twisted into unnatural shapes, a series of faded billboards advertising places that no longer existed. It was as if Route 19 was pulling her deeper into its own world, a place where time and reality were twisted beyond recognition. "Please," she whispered, gripping the wheel until her knuckles turned white. "Please, just let me go." But Route 19 offered no mercy. The road stretched on, dark and infinite, as if it had no end, only a series of horrors waiting for those foolish enough to drive its cursed path. Sarah's knuckles were white as she gripped the wheel, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. She didn't know how long she had been driving, but time felt meaningless now. The road before her seemed to twist and stretch, turning familiar landmarks into eerie shadows that loomed over her like watchful guardians. She tried to shake the feeling, but the text on her phone echoed in her mind, "You can't escape us, Sarah. Not on this road." Her headlights illuminated an old, crooked sign up ahead, barely legible through the rust and dirt that had collected over the years. She squinted, reading the faded words, "Welcome to Claymore Hollow. Population 1214. She frowned. She knew every town along Route 19, and this one wasn't on any map she'd ever seen. Yet, here it was, appearing as if conjured from the darkness itself. Just as she was about to turn around, hoping to retrace her steps, her truck sputtered, and the engine went silent. The headlights flickered once, twice, and then died, leaving her plunged into a thick, suffocating darkness. Her fingers trembled as she tried to restart the engine, but it was no use. The silence around her was absolute, broken only by the soft rustle of leaves in the night breeze. "Come on," she whispered, a desperate edge in her voice. But the truck remained dead. With no other choice, she grabbed her flashlight from the glove compartment, casting its weak beam into the night as she stepped out of the vehicle. The air felt colder here, as if the warmth of life itself had been drained from this place. Every instinct told her to stay inside, to wait for morning, but a strange pull urged her forward, deeper into Claymore Hollow. The town was eerily silent as she walked down its deserted main street. Old, dilapidated buildings lined both sides of the road, their windows dark and empty. There were no signs of life, no distant hum of electricity, no barking dogs or chirping crickets. Just the heavy, oppressive silence that wrapped around her like a shroud. Sarah's flashlight swept across a faded storefront, revealing the name Delaney's Diner in chipped paint. She shuddered. The diner looked just like the one she worked at, but older, as though it had been abandoned for years. A flicker of movement caught her eye, and she turned, shining her flashlight into the shadows. She saw nothing at first, just a dark alley stretching between two buildings. But then, a figure emerged, stepping into the dim beam of her light. It was a woman, her face gaunt and pale, her eyes vacant. She wore a waitress's uniform that looked eerily similar to Sarah's own. "Can I help you?" Sarah managed to ask, her voice quivering. The woman's head tilted slightly, as if studying her, and then she opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her lips moved, forming words that Sarah couldn't hear. Sarah took a step back, her heart hammering in her chest. Something about the woman felt wrong, like she was looking at a distorted reflection of herself. Suddenly, the woman's eyes locked onto hers, and a twisted smile stretched across her face, filled with a malice that made Sarah's skin crawl. "Leave me alone," Sarah whispered, backing away. But as she turned to leave, the woman's voice finally reached her, a harsh, rasping whisper that seemed to echo from all directions. "You belong here, Sarah," the voice said. "You've always belonged here." Sarah broke into a run, her footsteps echoing off the empty buildings. Her flashlight wavered, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for her as she stumbled back toward her truck. She didn't look back, didn't want to see if the woman was following her. She just kept running, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. When she reached her truck, she yanked the door open and scrambled inside, locking it behind her. She tried the ignition again, and to her relief, the engine sputtered to life. She didn't waste a second, throwing the truck into gear and speeding down the road, away from the eerie town that should not have existed. But as she drove, the landscape around her shifted. The trees grew denser, their branches hanging over the road like skeletal arms. The headlights illuminated strange symbols carved into the bark, symbols that seemed to pulse and writhe in the shadows. Her mind raced with questions, but she was too terrified to slow down, too consumed by the need to escape. Then, as abruptly as it had all started, she saw the edge of the forest give way to open fields, the road straightening out as she left the dense trees behind. Relief washed over her, but it was quickly replaced by confusion. Ahead, just off the road, she saw the same gas station she'd stopped at earlier, its flickering neon sign casting an unnatural glow. She slowed down, staring in disbelief. She'd been driving for hours, and yet somehow, she was right back where she'd started. Her hands trembled as she pulled up to the gas station once more. She knew it was insane, but she felt compelled to go inside, to see if the old man was still there. She stepped out of the truck, and as she approached the gas station, the bell over the door jangled, just as it had before. But this time, the place was dark, abandoned. The shelves were empty, the counter covered in a thick layer of dust. Her flashlight swept across the room, landing on something that hadn't been there earlier, a framed photograph hanging on the wall behind the counter. She approached it slowly, her heart pounding as she recognized the faces in the photograph. It was her, standing in front of Delaney's diner, smiling, surrounded by other people she didn't recognize but felt oddly familiar. They all wore the same vacant expression as the woman she'd seen in Claymore Hollow. A shiver ran down her spine as she realized what she was seeing. The people in the photograph, they were all wearing name tags with her name on them. Every single one. "You can't leave, Sarah," a voice whispered from behind her, the same gravelly rasp that had haunted her all night. She spun around, but there was no one there, only the empty gas station and the faint, lingering scent of gasoline and dust. Panicked, she turned and ran back to her truck, the bells jangle following her like a haunting echo. She climbed inside, locking the doors and gripping the steering wheel tightly. Her eyes darted back to the gas station, but it was dark, empty, as if mocking her desperation to escape. As she pulled away, the last thing she saw was her own reflection in the rearview mirror, her eyes vacant, her face pale, just like the others in the photograph. The weight of dread hung over Sarah like a shroud as she drove. Her truck's headlights cut through the night, revealing an endless road that stretched on, mocking her every attempt to escape. She didn't know how many times she'd passed the same mile markers, the same twisted trees with their strange symbols etched into the bark. Route 19 had turned into an inescapable loop, dragging her deeper into its dark, insidious grip. She glanced at the photograph she'd taken from the gas station, now lying on the passenger seat. Her own face stared back at her, surrounded by the hauntingly familiar figures from Claymore Hollow. They were smiling, but it was the kind of smile that held no warmth, only a chilling emptiness. Sarah tried to shake off the image, to focus on the road, but a creeping sensation crawled up her spine. She could feel eyes on her, watching her every move. Then, as if in response to her mounting fear, the radio crackled to life, filling the truck with static. Sarah reached to turn it off, but a voice emerged from the static, a whisper that made her skin crawl. "Sarah. We're waiting?" She yanked her hand back, her heart pounding. The voice was familiar, the same voice she'd heard from the woman in Claymore Hollow, the same voice that had called to her from the shadows. It was no longer just a haunting echo, it felt real, pressing, insistent. Her hands gripped the wheel tighter. She tried to ignore it, to drown out the voice with her own panicked breathing. The road began to change again. Familiar landmarks twisted into grotesque shapes, buildings she'd never seen before appeared, crumbling and overgrown with vines. She passed a school with shattered windows, a playground with rusted swings that creaked in the wind, moving as though pushed by invisible hands. And then she saw it, a figure standing at the side of the road, waving her down. Against her better judgment, she slowed down, her headlights illuminating the figure. It was a man, his clothes tattered and dirty, his face gaunt and shadowed. He looked up as her truck rolled to a stop, his eyes wide and haunted, like he hadn't seen another soul in years. "Please," he rasped, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Please. Help me?" Sarah hesitated, her fingers hovering over the door handle. Every instinct screamed at her to drive, to leave him behind. But the desperation in his eyes held her captive, a silent plea that tugged at her heart despite the terror gnawing at her. Are you lost, too?" she managed to ask, her voice trembling. He nodded, his gaze drifting to the endless road behind her. "Been here? Can't leave? No matter how far I go, it always brings me back. Same road. Same horrors." The words struck her like a punch to the gut. She had hoped she was the only one trapped in this nightmare, that maybe she could find a way out if she kept driving. But this man was living proof that Route 19 was a prison, an endless loop with no escape. "Please," he whispered, a hint of desperation slipping into his voice. "Take me with you. Maybe if we're together, we can break free." Sarah swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. She unlocked the passenger door, and he climbed in, his hands shaking as he settled into the seat beside her. His presence was both a comfort and a reminder of the hopelessness they faced, two lost souls bound by the cursed road. As they drove, he began to talk, his voice low and steady, recounting his story of how he had ended up here. "I was just passing through, like you," he said, staring out the window. "Thought it was just another road. But then, The things I saw. Shadows that follow you, voices that know your name. Sarah nodded, her grip tightening on the wheel. It's like the road doesn't want us to leave, she whispered, barely able to admit it aloud. The man turned to her, his expression grave. This road. It's not a place. It's a trap, feeding off of fear and memories. I've seen people come and go, but the road always brings them back. Some. They disappear, become part of it. Like ghosts. A shiver ran through her. Is there any way out? She asked, desperation clawing at her chest. He hesitated, then shook his head slowly. I don't know. But I think if we face it, whatever it is that's haunting us, maybe it'll let us go. Maybe it's our fear that keeps us here. Sarah wanted to argue, to insist that running was their only hope, but deep down, she knew he was right. The road had twisted her worst fears, made her relive moments she thought she'd buried. Perhaps facing them was her only chance. They drove in silence for a few miles until the landscape began to shift again. The familiar gas station appeared on the horizon, but this time, it was different. It was illuminated, warm light spilling from the windows, beckoning them like a lighthouse in the dark. I think this is it, the man whispered. The end. Or the beginning. She parked the truck, and they both stepped out, their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. The gas station door creaked open as they approached, as if inviting them inside. Sarah's heart raced, but she forced herself to take the first step, then another, until she was standing in the doorway. Inside, the old man from before was waiting, his dark eyes glinting in the dim light. He didn't look surprised to see her, or her new companion. Instead, he simply smiled, a knowing, almost sad expression crossing his face. You're back, he said, his voice a soft murmur. They always come back. Sarah swallowed, feeling a strange calm settle over her. Why are we here? What is this place? The old man's gaze softened. A place for the lost, those who carry burdens too heavy to leave behind. This road, it holds on to what you fear, what you regret. And until you face it, you'll keep coming back. Sarah glanced at the man beside her, who nodded, urging her to go on. She took a deep breath, allowing the memories to flood over her, of the mistakes she'd made, the fears she'd buried, the roads she'd avoided. She spoke them aloud, her voice steady as she laid bare her regrets, her pain. When she finished, a strange lightness filled her, a sense of release she hadn't felt in years. The old man nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Go now? The road will let you pass. Without another word, she and her companion left the gas station, stepping back into the cool night air. As they climbed into the truck and drove, the road before them began to change, the darkness lifting as the familiar sights of Route 19 gave way to a real, open road stretching toward freedom. For the first time, Sarah felt hope, a hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd finally escaped the haunting grip of Route 19. Every small town has its legends, and for Havenbrook, that was Henderson's diner. Perched just off the long stretch of Interstate 52, it had the kind of reputation that was both a lure and a warning. Locals whispered about it, and truckers would shake their heads, calling it a last resort stop. On most nights, it was quiet, a greasy spoon that had seen better days. But those who worked the night shift knew better. They knew the shadows that lingered there had a habit of shifting, creeping closer, and sometimes, whispering your name. Tonight was Hannah Grayson's first solo shift. She'd been a waitress at Henderson's for 6 months, covering mostly the safer afternoon hours. But after her mom's hospital bills started piling up, Hannah took on extra hours to make ends meet. She told herself the night shift was just a shift, no different than any other. Yet, as the clock inched closer to midnight, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling twisting in her stomach. "Are you sure you'll be all right, hun?" the last of her co-workers, Rita, asked as she slung her purse over her shoulder. Rita had worked at Henderson's for over a decade and avoided the night shift like the plague. "You've got your cell phone, right?" Hannah forced a smile. "I'll be fine, Rita. It's just a quiet night. Nothing to worry about." She said it more to convince herself than to reassure Rita. Still, her voice wavered, and she could see the concern etched on Rita's face. "Well? All right. Just remember, don't go out back." "Not for anything?" Rita's voice had dropped to a whisper, and her eyes darted toward the back door of the diner, barely visible in the dim light of the kitchen. "No matter what you hear, stay inside." With that, Rita slipped out the door, leaving Hannah alone with the hum of the fluorescent lights and the faint, almost imperceptible ticking of the diner clock. The hours dragged on, and with each tick of the clock, Hannah's unease grew. She served 1 or 2 late-night truckers, but they didn't stay long. By 1:30 a.m., the diner was deserted. She wiped down the counters, her back to the large windows that lined the front of the diner, feeling as though someone, or something, was watching her. The quiet was unnatural, as if the whole world had gone still, waiting for something. The bell above the diner's door jingled, startling her out of her thoughts. She turned, her heart pounding, only to see a man standing in the doorway, his frame silhouetted by the flickering streetlight outside. He was tall, with a face that looked weathered and worn, his eyes hidden beneath the shadow of his hat. "Coffee," he rasped, his voice low and gravelly. Hannah nodded, grabbing a mug and pouring the hot coffee with hands that shook slightly. She slid it across the counter to him, and he took it without a word, his gaze never leaving her. "So, you're the new night shift, huh?" he said after a moment, his voice carrying a strange note, almost like amusement. Hannah nodded, unsure of how to respond. "You know, they say Henderson's has a history." Hannah forced a laugh. "Just rumors, right?" She tried to sound light-hearted, but the man's expression remained unchanged. He leaned closer, his face now visible in the dim light. His eyes were cold, almost lifeless. "Rumors have a way of being true, especially out here." He held her gaze for a long moment before taking a sip of his coffee, his eyes dark and unreadable. As the minutes dragged on, the man sat silently, sipping his coffee, his eyes occasionally darting to the back door, as if he expected something, or someone, to come through. Hannah could feel her pulse quicken. The silence grew thick, pressing in on her, until it felt like she could barely breathe. The man eventually finished his coffee, his gaze lingering on Hannah, as he slid the empty mug back across the counter. "You know, I'd keep my wits about me if I were you. There's a reason people don't like working the night shift here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. With that, he stood, adjusted his hat, and left without another word, the doorbell jingling as he stepped out into the dark. Hannah watched as his silhouette disappeared into the shadows beyond the diner's lights. She let out a shaky breath, trying to ignore the way her hands trembled. The diner felt emptier than before, as though the man had taken something with him when he left, something vital that left a void behind. She tried to shake it off, chalking it up to nerves and the man's strange demeanor. As the clock ticked closer to 2:30 a.m., Hannah busied herself wiping down the tables, sweeping the floor, and making sure everything was in its place. She glanced at the back door now and then, remembering Rita's warning. But it was quiet back there, too quiet, she realized. The usual hum of the ancient refrigerator in the storage room seemed to have stopped, leaving only silence. Suddenly, there was a faint scraping sound from the back. It was subtle, like someone dragging a foot across the floor, just loud enough to send a chill down her spine. She froze, listening, her heart hammering in her chest. The sound came again, closer this time, accompanied by a soft rustling, as if something was moving just beyond the door. Hello. Hannah called out, her voice shaky. She took a step toward the back door, cursing herself for her curiosity but unable to resist the pull of the noise. She told herself it was probably just a stray cat or raccoon that had managed to get into the storage room. Still, the memory of Rita's warning echoed in her mind, "Don't go out back." Ignoring her better judgment, she inched closer, her hand outstretched toward the door. Just as her fingers brushed the handle, the door rattled violently, as though something on the other side was trying to force its way in. Hannah stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat, a scream lodged somewhere deep within her. The door went still, and silence filled the room once more. Hannah's hand flew to her mouth as she tried to steady her breathing, heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. She waited, every muscle tensed, eyes glued to the door. Just when she thought she might have imagined it all, the rattling resumed, this time even fiercer, almost desperate. "Hannah," a voice whispered, so faint she wasn't even sure she'd heard it. It was a raspy, broken sound, as though the person speaking was right on the other side of the door. She took a step back, her eyes wide with terror. No one knew her name tonight. Only Rita, and the man in the hat. She grabbed her phone from her pocket, her hands shaking as she dialed the first number that came to mind, Rita's. The phone rang once, twice, then went to voicemail. She tried again, but the call wouldn't connect this time, as though her phone had lost service. Frustrated and frightened, she backed away from the door, her eyes darting around the empty diner. Just then, a low creak sounded behind her. She spun around to see one of the stools at the counter slowly turning, as though someone had just taken a seat. But no one was there. Hannah's heart skipped a beat, and she stumbled back, feeling the cold metal of the counter pressing into her spine. Her mind raced, trying to rationalize what was happening, but the fear was overpowering. For a long moment, silence fell once again, broken only by the faint hum of the overhead lights. Then, a faint scratching began, this time from beneath the floorboards, directly under her feet. Hannah clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream, feeling the boards vibrate ever so slightly as the scratching grew louder, more insistent, as though whatever was down there was trying to claw its way up to the surface. Hannah's knees threatened to buckle as the scratching intensified beneath her feet. Her mind raced, struggling to grasp some kind of logical explanation, but nothing made sense. It felt as though the entire diner had transformed, shifting into something hostile, something alive and aware of her presence. She staggered backward, never taking her eyes off the floor, her breathing shallow and panicked. Just as she reached the counter, the scratching stopped. For a brief moment, she felt a rush of relief, until she heard a new sound, one that sent an icy chill down her spine. It was a whisper, low and hoarse, echoing from somewhere near the back. The words were indistinct at first, barely more than a hiss, but slowly they became clearer, each syllable laced with an unnatural malice. "Hannah. Come. Closer?" Her stomach twisted as she heard her own name, spoken with a dark, almost playful tone. She whipped her head toward the sound, her eyes darting to the back door, which seemed to loom larger in the dim light. Her mind screamed at her to run, to get out of the diner, but her feet were rooted to the spot, as though an invisible force held her in place. Then, as if on cue, the overhead lights began to flicker, casting erratic shadows that danced along the walls. Each flash revealed something different, a chair slightly moved, a shadow stretching longer than it should, shapes shifting in the corners of her vision. It felt as though the very fabric of the diner was warping, bending around her in a sick, surreal nightmare. Desperately, she looked down at her phone again, praying for a signal, but the screen remained stubbornly blank, refusing to reconnect. Her fingers shook as she tapped through her contacts, her mind racing. She could try calling the police, but would they even believe her? And what could she say? That she was being haunted by whispers and scratches in an empty diner. A loud bang from the back door snapped her out of her thoughts. The door rattled once more, but this time, it was accompanied by a guttural growl, deep and feral, like a wild animal trapped on the other side. Hannah clamped her hands over her ears, squeezing her eyes shut, hoping that if she ignored it, it would stop. But the growling only grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the empty diner until it felt like it was inside her head. In a desperate attempt to escape the noise, she darted behind the counter, crouching down as if that flimsy barrier could somehow protect her. She bit her lip, willing herself not to cry, not to scream. She had to stay calm, had to figure out a way out of this nightmare. But just as she took a shaky breath, the lights flickered once more, and then went out completely, plunging the diner into darkness. The silence that followed was suffocating. She could barely see her own hand in front of her face, but she didn't dare move. Every instinct screamed at her to stay still, to not make a sound, as though whatever was lurking in the shadows could only find her if she revealed herself. For what felt like an eternity, she held her breath, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure it would give her away. Suddenly, a faint glow appeared in the darkness, flickering like a candle flame. It hovered near the back door, illuminating a figure, tall, with impossibly long limbs and hollow eyes that seemed to absorb the light around them. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and its mouth stretched into a grotesque, twisted grin. "Hannah." The figure whispered, its voice a chilling blend of voices, layered and distorted, as though a dozen people were speaking at once. "We've been waiting." Hannah's blood ran cold. She scrambled back, her fingers gripping the counter's edge as she tried to put as much distance as possible between herself and the figure. She knew she should run, that she had to escape, but her body refused to cooperate, paralyzed by sheer terror. The figure took a step closer, its movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring her fear. "You shouldn't have come here alone," it rasped, each word dripping with malice. "This place. It keeps what it claims. And now, it's claimed you." With a surge of adrenaline, Hannah finally broke free of her paralysis. She bolted toward the front door, fumbling with the lock, her fingers slipping as she struggled to twist it open. Behind her, she could hear the figure's footsteps, slow and measured, echoing through the darkness. Each step sent a jolt of terror through her, propelling her faster, desperate to escape before it closed the distance. She managed to wrench the door open and stumbled out into the cold night air. But as she turned back to look at the diner, she froze. Through the window, she could see the figure standing in the doorway, its hollow eyes fixed on her, that twisted grin still stretched across its face. And as the diner's lights flickered back on, illuminating the empty booths and silent kitchen, she realized with a sickening dread that the figure was no longer alone. Hannah's legs trembled as she stumbled backward, her eyes fixed on the figures inside the diner. They were shadowy, barely visible through the glass, but she could make out the shapes, people, or what was left of them, moving in eerie unison toward the front of the diner. Their faces were indistinct, features blurred as though they were merely reflections on dark water. But their eyes, empty, hollow pits, were unmistakably focused on her. She backed away, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps, and turned to run. The night was eerily quiet, the world around her still and cold. Her footsteps echoed off the pavement as she sprinted toward her car, parked under the lone streetlight that flickered in and out, casting long, shifting shadows across the deserted lot. Reaching the car, she fumbled with her keys, her fingers shaking so violently that they slipped from her grasp, clattering to the ground. She dropped to her knees, her heart racing as she scrambled to retrieve them, glancing over her shoulder. The figures had exited the diner now, their slow, shuffling steps carrying them closer, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Finally, she managed to grab the keys, her hands slick with sweat, and jammed one into the lock. She wrenched the door open and threw herself inside, slamming it shut behind her. Her hands shook as she twisted the key in the ignition, the car sputtering to life. She didn't dare look back as she threw it into drive, her tires screeching against the asphalt, as she sped out of the lot. For a moment, she felt a brief surge of relief, the diner shrinking in her rearview mirror. She allowed herself a single, shaky breath, her mind racing to process what had happened. But the relief was short-lived. As she glanced in the rearview mirror, her heart sank. There, in the back seat, was a shadow, a figure hunched and silent, its face obscured but unmistakably there. "Hannah," it whispered, and she felt a cold hand brush her shoulder, sending a jolt of ice through her veins. She screamed, swerving the car, nearly losing control. The figure's hand tightened on her shoulder, its grip cold and unyielding, pulling her backward, forcing her to turn and face it. Its face was mere inches from hers now, a ghastly, hollow expression that seemed to shift and warp, features melting and reforming in a sickening, endless loop. "You can't escape," it murmured, its voice a distorted blend of whispers that echoed in her ears. "You're part of us now." Desperation clawed at her as she wrestled with the steering wheel, her mind a haze of terror and adrenaline. She slammed her foot on the brake, the car skidding to a halt. The figure lurched forward with the sudden stop, vanishing in an instant, leaving only the empty, silent darkness of the car. Her breaths came in shallow gasps as she looked around, the faint hum of the engine the only sound in the night. But just as she allowed herself to hope that it was over, she felt a prickling sensation at the back of her neck. Slowly, she turned to look out the passenger window. There, outside her car, under the flickering streetlight, was the tall figure she had seen in the diner. It stood motionless, watching her, that twisted grin still stretched across its face. She threw the car into drive, her hands trembling, and sped down the road, her foot pressing the accelerator as hard as it would go. The lights of the diner disappeared in the distance, swallowed by the darkness, but the figure's image was burned into her mind. She drove for what felt like hours, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, eyes darting to every shadow, every dark shape along the roadside. Finally, exhausted and drained, she spotted a gas station up ahead, its neon lights a beacon in the empty night. She pulled into the lot, her car rolling to a stop as she rested her forehead on the steering wheel, trying to calm her racing heart. The gas station was quiet, a lone attendant inside, watching her with mild curiosity. She forced herself to step out of the car, her legs shaky, and stumbled toward the gas station doors. Inside, the attendant looked at her with a concerned frown. "You okay, miss?" he asked, eyeing her disheveled appearance. Hannah opened her mouth to respond, to somehow explain the terror that had chased her from Henderson's, but no words came out. She glanced around, trying to ground herself in the normalcy of the gas station's bright fluorescent lights and generic pop music playing softly in the background. But as her gaze shifted to the glass door, her heart stopped. Reflected in the glass, standing right behind her, was the figure, tall, hollow-eyed, and grinning, its cold, lifeless gaze fixed directly on her. Hannah's scream echoed through the gas station, but no one else seemed to hear it. The attendant merely blinked, looking at her as though she hadn't moved, as though she were still standing there, silent. She turned, but the figure was gone, vanished as quickly as it had appeared. She was left staring into the empty reflection, feeling the cold, creeping realization that she would never truly be alone again. And as she backed away, Her eyes still on the door, she saw something etched into the glass, barely visible but unmistakable. It was a single word, scratched in jagged, uneven letters that seemed to pulse with an eerie glow: Henderson's. In the small town of Willow Ridge, rumors had a life of their own. Locals whispered about the old cemetery at the edge of town, a place most avoided, especially at night. At its heart stood the graveyard gardener, a figure as mysterious as he was unsettling. He was rarely seen outside the fog-shrouded grounds, but those who had glimpsed him spoke of an older man, his clothes tattered and worn, with eyes that gleamed with an unnatural understanding. No one knew his name or his age, and those who ventured too close to him felt a coldness, as if their own secrets were laid bare before him. One autumn evening, Harold Blake returned to Willow Ridge after being away for nearly 20 years. A thin, haunted man with silver streaks in his hair, he was back for his mother's funeral, a duty he'd been dreading. He had escaped this town and its memories, or so he thought, but standing in front of his childhood home brought it all rushing back. His mother had been buried in that very graveyard under the watchful eyes of the mysterious gardener, a thought that chilled him more than the cool October air. At the funeral, Harold's attention kept drifting toward the shadowed figure near the gate. The gardener was watching, hands clasped in front of him, head tilted ever so slightly. Harold found himself caught in the man's gaze, unable to look away, as if the gardener was reading something in him that he wasn't ready to face. After the service ended and the last of the mourners had left, Harold found himself lingering by his mother's freshly turned grave. Lost something? A voice rasped behind him. Harold turned sharply to see the gardener standing just a few feet away. Up close, the man looked older than he had expected, his skin pale and thin, stretched like parchment over his bones. His eyes were piercing, almost too bright for his age. The man's lips twisted into a strange, knowing smile. Just memories, Harold replied, his voice barely a whisper. The gardener nodded, his gaze flickering toward the grave. Memories have a way of coming back, especially around here. But they're not always what they seem. What do you mean? Harold asked, feeling a strange weight settle in his chest. The gardener tilted his head, studying Harold for a moment. Every person here has left something behind. Sometimes it's a regret, sometimes it's a secret. Sometimes it's a burden. You left something, too, didn't you? Harold's throat tightened. He wanted to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. It felt as if the gardener could see right through him, into the parts of his past he'd buried along with his shame. But how could this man possibly know? Who are you? He managed to ask. Just a gardener, the man replied, his smile widening. But I can tell you this, things have a way of surfacing here. You'll see, Mr. Blake. You'll see. Harold's heart pounded as he watched the gardener walk away, vanishing into the mist that clung to the graves like a shroud. There was something sinister about the man, something that felt ancient, timeless. As Harold stood alone in the darkening graveyard, he felt an overwhelming urge to leave Willow Ridge immediately. But he knew it was too late. Something had already pulled him back, something he didn't understand yet but could feel lurking in the shadows of his past. Harold's nights in Willow Ridge quickly became filled with restless dreams. The old family home, left untouched since his mother's passing, seemed to creak and groan under the weight of memories he had tried so hard to forget. Shadows lingered longer than they should, and each time he closed his eyes, he saw the graveyard gardener's face, those piercing eyes burrowing into his mind, bringing back pieces of a past he'd rather keep buried. One night, as he lay awake in the dim silence, he heard a faint scratching at his door. The sound was subtle at first, like the wind brushing against the frame, but it grew louder, more insistent, until it sounded as if something, or someone, was clawing to get inside. Heart pounding, Harold swung his legs over the side of the bed and crept toward the door. He held his breath, fingers curling around the doorknob. With a quick motion, he yanked the door open, expecting to see an animal or some prankster. But there was nothing there. Only the hallway stretched out before him, shrouded in darkness. As he closed the door, he noticed something on the floor, a small, withered flower petal. It was dried and brittle, the kind often found on graves. He picked it up, feeling a chill run through him. That was when he heard the whisper, faint yet unmistakable, drifting from somewhere in the house. "Harold." The voice was soft, filled with longing and sorrow, as if it came from a place far beyond the walls of his home. The next day, sleep-deprived and unsettled, Harold found himself wandering back to the cemetery. He didn't know why he was drawn there, but the pull was irresistible. The air was thick with mist, and the scent of damp earth filled his nostrils as he walked among the graves. The gardener was nowhere to be seen, yet Harold felt the man's presence, watching him from some unseen corner. Near his mother's grave, he noticed something peculiar. A small, polished stone lay on the freshly turned soil, engraved with a symbol he didn't recognize. It looked ancient, an intricate spiral that seemed to draw his gaze inward, as if it were alive with some dark energy. He reached down to pick it up, but a voice stopped him. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," the gardener's voice rasped from behind. Harold whipped around, startled. The gardener was standing there, his face as expressionless as ever, yet his eyes were sharper, more intense. "What is this?" Harold asked, gesturing toward the stone. "A reminder," the gardener replied, his voice low. "For those who've tried to leave their past behind. Sometimes, the things we bury have a way of coming back." Harold's face flushed with frustration. "What do you want from me?" "I came here for my mother's funeral, nothing more." The gardener's lips curled into a cryptic smile. "Did you really think you could come back to Willow Ridge and not face what you left behind? This town has a way of remembering, even when you try to forget." Harold felt a pang of anger mixed with fear. "I don't owe this town anything." The gardener's eyes narrowed, his gaze turning cold. "Perhaps not. But the dead don't rest easy here, not when there are secrets still tangled in the roots of their graves." He nodded toward the stone on his mother's grave. "That's not for you. It's for her. A reminder of the things she carried. And the things you abandoned." Harold's throat tightened as he looked back at the stone, feeling a sudden wave of guilt wash over him. He had left his mother alone, knowing she was fragile, knowing she needed him. And now here he was, back in the town he'd sworn never to return to, forced to confront the shadows he'd tried to leave behind. Before he could say anything, the gardener turned and walked away, his figure vanishing into the mist. Harold stood alone, his mind reeling with questions and a gnawing sense of dread. The whisper he'd heard last night echoed in his memory, and he couldn't shake the feeling that his mother's spirit was reaching out to him, demanding something he wasn't ready to face. As the sun began to set, casting eerie shadows over the graves, Harold made his way back to his car, but he couldn't escape the weight of the past bearing down on him. The gardener's words lingered in his mind, filling him with a foreboding sense that he was far from done with Willow Ridge, and that Willow Ridge was far from done with him. The nightmares grew worse. Every night, Harold found himself wandering through the graveyard in his sleep, stumbling over old stones and tangled roots, always searching for something he couldn't quite remember. His mother's voice haunted him, whispering things he barely understood, fragments of warnings and pleas. And every time he awoke, there was that same withered petal on the floor beside his bed, a small, unsettling reminder of the graveyard's reach into his home. One evening, after another fitful sleep, Harold made his way back to the cemetery, feeling like a puppet drawn by unseen strings. He arrived as the last light faded from the sky, casting long shadows over the graves. The air was colder than usual, a sharp, biting chill that clung to his skin and seeped into his bones. He had barely set foot inside the gates when he saw the gardener, standing by his mother's grave, waiting. "You're back," the gardener said, his voice carrying a note of grim satisfaction. "Good. There's work to be done." "What are you talking about?" Harold's voice wavered, exhaustion etched into his face. "Why can't you just leave me alone?" The gardener's gaze softened slightly, though his expression remained as inscrutable as ever. "It's not about me, Mr. Blake. It's about you. About the things you left undone." He gestured to the ground beside his mother's grave, where fresh dirt lay unsettled. "There's something here that needs to be brought to light." Harold felt a pang of fear but also a strange sense of inevitability. He looked down, his hands shaking as he crouched beside the disturbed soil. The gardener handed him a small, rusted trowel, and Harold took it, feeling the weight of it in his hand. With a deep breath, he began to dig, the dirt cool and damp beneath his fingers. After a few moments, the trowel struck something hard. He froze, his heart pounding as he brushed away the soil to reveal a small, wooden box, its surface dark and splintered with age. A faint, acrid smell wafted from it, and Harold felt his stomach twist in revulsion. He looked up at the gardener, whose gaze was fixed intently on the box. "What is this?" Harold whispered, barely able to speak. "A memory," the gardener replied, his voice low. "One that should have stayed buried." Harold's hands trembled as he lifted the box from the ground. It was heavier than he'd expected, as though it held not just objects but secrets he tried to forget. Slowly, he opened the lid, revealing a collection of old photographs, letters, and small trinkets. His breath caught in his throat as he recognized one of the photos, a picture of him as a boy, standing beside his mother, both of them smiling. But there was something wrong about the image, something unsettling in the way his mother's eyes seemed to look through him, as if she knew even then what he would become. One of the letters caught his eye. It was addressed to him, written in his mother's careful handwriting. He opened it with trembling hands, his eyes scanning the words, a mixture of love and sorrow spilling from the page. She had known about his plans to leave, known that he'd never intended to come back. She had begged him, in words both gentle and pleading, to stay, to help her, to not abandon her as everyone else had. And he had ignored her, selfishly pursuing his own life, never once looking back. As he read, tears blurred his vision, guilt and regret clawing at his heart. His mother's words were filled with pain, a pain he had caused. She had been alone, left to wither in this forgotten town, with only her memories and regrets to keep her company. And now, somehow, those regrets had become his own, binding him to the place he had tried so hard to escape. "I didn't know," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I didn't know she felt this way." The gardener's expression softened, a rare flicker of sympathy crossing his face. "That's the thing about regret, Mr. Blake. It waits, silent and patient, until there's no running from it. You can't escape the things you leave behind." Harold lowered his head, the weight of his mother's words pressing down on him, suffocating. He wanted to leave, to flee from this cursed town and never look back, but he knew it wouldn't matter. His mother's spirit, the gardener's watchful gaze, the memories he had buried, all of it would follow him, haunting him wherever he went. "What do I do now?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The gardener nodded toward his mother's grave. "Make peace with her. Tell her what you never had the courage to say. She may be gone, but the dead can hear more than you think. Speak to her, and maybe, just maybe, she'll let you go." Harold looked at his mother's grave, feeling a swell of sorrow and regret that he couldn't hold back. Kneeling down, he placed his hand on the cold stone, closing his eyes as he whispered apologies, confessions, words he had never dared to say aloud. The air grew still, as though the very ground was listening, absorbing his every word. When he finally looked up, the gardener was gone, leaving Harold alone in the dim light, the silence heavy with a strange sense of release. For the first time in years, he felt lighter, as though a part of the weight he carried had been lifted. But a flicker of fear remained, a shadow in his heart that whispered there was still one more chapter to be written. Days passed, and Harold began to feel as though he'd finally made peace with his past. The weight of his guilt had lessened, though a sense of melancholy lingered, settling over him like a fog. He visited the cemetery every day, leaving flowers at his mother's grave and talking to her as though she was still alive. He never saw the gardener again, and part of him wondered if the man had ever truly been there at all, or if he had been some spectral figure, a manifestation of Harold's own remorse. One evening, as he prepared to leave Willow Ridge for the last time, he decided to take one final walk through the graveyard. The sky was overcast, casting a muted, grey light over the gravestones, and the familiar chill settled into his bones as he made his way to his mother's resting place. But as he approached her grave, he noticed something strange. Another stone had been added beside hers, a smaller one, unmarked and plain. Confused, he knelt to examine it. There was no name, no date, just a rough, simple stone that looked as though it had been there for decades. He reached out to touch it, and as his fingers brushed the cold surface, a strange sensation washed over him, a feeling of recognition that he couldn't quite place. It was as if this stone held a part of his own soul, something he had left behind and forgotten. Lost something. A familiar voice rasped. Harold whipped around, his heart pounding, to see the gardener standing behind him. His eyes gleamed with that same eerie understanding, a knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I thought you were gone," Harold said, his voice trembling. The gardener shrugged. "We're never truly gone from the places that hold us, are we?" Harold frowned, feeling a surge of frustration. "What do you want from me? I've done what you asked. I've made peace with my mother. I'm leaving this place?" The gardener's smile faded, replaced by a look of solemnity. "Are you? Leaving, I mean? Willow Ridge is a place that holds on to people, especially those who try to run from their past. You may think you've made peace, but there's one last thing you must face." Harold felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. "What are you talking about?" The gardener stepped closer, his gaze piercing. "Look again, at the stone. Look closely." Harold glanced back at the small, unmarked stone, feeling a growing sense of unease. As he stared, the fog around it seemed to lift, revealing faint, barely visible letters etched into the surface. His breath caught in his throat as he read the words, "Harold Blake, 1979 to 2024. "No," he whispered, stumbling backward, his heart racing. "This can't be. I'm not." The gardener nodded slowly, his expression one of quiet understanding. "You never truly left Willow Ridge, Harold. You died here, long ago. All these years, you've been wandering, haunted by the life you abandoned, unable to move on." Harold's mind reeled, memories flooding back, moments he'd forgotten, flashes of his younger self walking through this very graveyard, feeling the same sense of dread, the same weight of his mother's words. He remembered leaving town, the drive down the winding roads, the sharp turn that had sent his car careening into the ravine. And then? Nothing. Just the endless years of wandering, of trying to bury his guilt, of running from the truth. But I've been alive. I've been, he stammered, clutching at the fabric of his shirt, feeling his heart racing beneath his hand. The gardener shook his head gently. You've been caught in a loop, Harold. A shadow, bound to this place by your regrets, by the things you left undone? Until now. Harold sank to his knees, staring at the stone bearing his own name, feeling the weight of his fate settling over him. He looked up at the gardener, his voice choked with despair. What do I do? How do I find peace? The gardener's gaze softened, his tone gentle. You already have. By facing your mother, by acknowledging the truth. The dead may walk among the living, but they cannot lie to themselves forever. It's time for you to let go. As the gardener spoke, Harold felt a strange sensation, a warmth spreading through his chest, melting away the cold that had clung to him for so long. The fog around him lifted, and he saw his mother's face in his mind, smiling, free of the sorrow and disappointment he had carried with him. She was at peace. And, finally, so was he. The world around him began to fade, the colors draining from his vision, replaced by a gentle, all-encompassing light. He looked up at the gardener one last time, seeing not the eerie figure he had feared, but a guide, a friend who had helped him find the closure he'd been seeking. Thank you, he whispered, his voice filled with gratitude. The gardener nodded, his face a calm, peaceful mask. Go well, Harold Blake. The dead rest easy here, now. And with that, Harold felt himself drift away, his soul finally free, leaving the graveyard silent and still beneath the watchful eyes of the gardener, who returned to his work, tending the graves of those who had finally found peace in Willow Ridge. Thank you for listening. Be sure to check out our channel for more stories.